We are likely getting closer and closer to that first announcement of a meeting between President Trump and President Putin, and or maybe it's his designated lieutenant with General Kellogg and somebody from the Russian side. We've been talking about Trump has been talking about really since 2023 how he's going to bring this war to an end. Now he's been inaugurated, and now everyone's basically just waiting. When is that first meeting going to happen, and what's going to be the result of it? We've been talking about some of that, but now really one of the more central questions is, what role will the Ukraine leader have? Will Ukraine even be involved in this, in the negotiations? Will European Union people be involved in this? Or is it really going to be just the individuals, Trump and Putin, and everybody else has to just sit and wait and watch? Obviously, there's a significant amount of ramifications for all of those parties as to how this is going to unfold. And but we're going to try and figure out what that's going to be based on, we're going to try to read the tea leaves a little bit, information that's been coming from a number of different quarters. And we'll try to lay it out for you, give you our best guess of what may be coming next. And to try and to do that here, we have back on the show after a bit of a hiatus, Kazianis, who is the president and editor of the publication 1945. You see me feature several things that I've written for them in there. He's been very gracious to let me publish some things there. It's a great publication. Lots of people are reading it these days. First of all, Harry, just welcome back to the show. Been a while.
Hey, Danny. Happy 2025.
And same to you. Same to you. Tell us a little bit about 1945, since that's kind of your main gig now.
Sure. So 1945, this big focus is on defense, national security, foreign policy. We don't go into politics that much because we are a bipartisan organization. We welcome all viewpoints, perspectives from, if Tulsi Gabbard wants to send us a piece, or John Bolton, who actually does write for 1945 as an occasional contributor. So we welcome everybody at the table. Just to give everybody an idea of our scale, we get about 50 million page views per month, which actually makes us the biggest foreign policy and national security publication on the planet right now. That could always change. There's a lot of competition out there, but our big thing, Danny, is we welcome all viewpoints, all perspectives. We don't censor anybody. And the big thing I would say is that we do not accept any foreign money, any grants. The entire publication is essentially based by the readers, by ads and syndication. So that's the only way that we make any money, and that means the quality has to be good.
And where's the title from, 1945?
It comes from just the end of World War II, that it happened to end in 1945. And the thinking was, when it was created was, 1945 is that pivotal year where the entire world changed, where the Cold War began, where Hiroshima and Nagasaki had nuclear bombs dropped on them. It was the beginning of the nuclear age. And for a lot of the people who started this website, it felt like every day was 1945. Like every day was some pivotal change, whether it's AI, whether it's drones, whether it's the doings and uncomings of financial markets, the rise of Donald Trump, the fall of Donald Trump, the re-rise of Donald Trump. So I think you get my point. It just seems like every day is just total chaos. And I think that's what 1945 kind of tries to sort of work on.
Well, I obviously I love it, not just because you publish my work, but because you include all the different viewpoints. So one of the things that I think, and one of the reasons we made our channel, is because we don't like echo chambers. It's just like, all right, if you're a lefty, you go to this place and you hear all lefty stuff, or if you're on a righty, you hear all that, whatever. But that doesn't help you actually solve problems. It doesn't help you actually find out where the people are, so you know how to find solutions. And that's one of the reasons why we are really happy about your organization, and happy to have you here today on that exact concept. And so let's just jump right into what is the concept today. We had, I think this was actually earlier today, Volodymyr Zelensky. I think he's kind of starting to read some of the tea leaves, and he's going, am I going to be left out of this little shindig when Trump and Putin meet? And he's trying to make a play for his side.
This can only be done with Ukraine, and otherwise it simply will not work, because Russia does not want to end the war and Ukraine does. What will be the platform for negotiations? I really hope that there will be Ukraine, America, Europe, and the Russians. Yes, I would really like for the European voice to be there too. It is important for us because we will be members of the European Union.
Okay, it seems odd to me that you're having this discussion from Zelensky right now at this stage, wondering if he's going to be at the table. What do you ascribe that to?
Wishful thinking, I think, at this point. Look, Danny, I think, to be honest with you, let's understand how these peace talks, or really what are going to be, I think, ceasefire talks at the beginning, are going to go. I think Keith Kellogg is probably going to meet Sergei Lavrov, maybe in Zurich in Switzerland, a neutral country. And there's going to be very preliminary discussions of what, at least I think, a ceasefire could look like. What would the contours could be? Would there be peacekeepers? What would be lines of control? Would there be demilitarized zones? Just in talking about a ceasefire, there's a lot to negotiate. Forget about some sort of peace treaty to end the war. Maybe we could talk about that a little later, because I don't think that's ever going to happen anyway. But I think that's the initial discussion. I think Lavrov will probe Kellogg to see if what Trump's view is on Ukraine joining NATO. If he gets a sense that Trump is against that, which I think it's pretty clear he is, I think he goes back to Moscow, reports to Putin, and then there's some sort of big summit where I honestly think there would have to probably be at least 2 summits to get to even a ceasefire, to be honest with you. Forget about peace treaties. The larger question, does Zelensky have a voice at these initial talks? I think initially, at least in the first round of negotiations, no, I don't think he does. I think this is, in the beginning, a great power discussion between the United States and Russia. I think Zelensky will have a voice later on once we get to something really firm on paper when it comes to a ceasefire. I think the United States will keep him in the loop. They will let him know at every stage of what's going on, whether it's those Kellogg-Lavrov discussions or those Putin-Trump discussions later on. So he'll certainly be, a voice that will be considered. So will the European Union. Absolutely. I think all parties that have a vested interest in this. But I think initially, Danny, I think the preliminary talks will just be, bilateral. And I think that's the way it has to be, at least in the beginning, because we have to figure out if there's a chance at a ceasefire. I think there is. I really do. I think if you freeze the lines of combat where they are now, I think that's ultimately that's where we're going to go with this.
Well, but let me ask you that, because that's actually a very, very important point, because virtually everyone, in fact, I am not aware of any exceptions in the West, think that you have to start with a ceasefire. But we've shown several times, from quote after quote, from everybody from Putin down to Lavrov and Peskov on down, and they say no chance. In fact, Lavrov says it's a road to nowhere. They wouldn't even consider it. So if Russia is actually non-negotiable on having a ceasefire, and you can understand why, because from a military perspective, they're on the ascendancy. So they would lose in a ceasefire and Ukraine would gain. If that's the case, and if the U.S. side is coming in thinking they're going to have a ceasefire, where's the Cox going to go from there?
It's going to be tough. I'm going to be honest. It's going to be really, really tough. I think what Trump could do to sort of sweeten the pot is, if Russia would agree to a ceasefire, I think he could say NATO's off the table for Ukraine. And I think, to be honest with you, we need to have that conversation right now in terms of the broader foreign policy community in the United States and Kiev and in Moscow, wherever. There is no chance in hell that Ukraine is ever joining NATO. It's never going to happen. You can call me whatever you name in the book you want to call me. For the people who are watching this, you can call me pro-Russian. It's just
Harry, I've been saying that there was never a chance for NATO to come in, no matter what Stoltenberg or everybody else said. It was always going to be that way.
We just need to keep saying it, because if that's what Ukraine is holding out for, just forget about it. It's not going to happen. So I think for Trump and Kellogg and anybody who's going to be involved in these discussions, I think it's not important to promise it just yet. You don't want to take out your big Trump card, if you will, you want to be able to use it and leverage it and get whatever you can out there. But I think you go to the Russians and say, look, both sides are exhausted. Yes, we understand you're in the ascendancy. Your military is doing quite well. But I think Trump has been smart to suggest that, maybe we could, and I don't think he will, but maybe there could be, more funding for Ukraine. And I hope that doesn't happen, but he's got to bluff that. He has to do that in those negotiations. But you could say, look, if we take NATO off the table, what would you think about a ceasefire? I mean, let's be honest. This is the reason why Russia went to war and invaded Ukraine in the first place. I don't care what anybody wants to say. That is the number one reason. They were afraid that in 10 to 15 years, Ukraine would be a full member of the EU, NATO. They would have a powerful military. They'd have an economy to match, and they'd be right on Russia's borders. I mean, imagine, Danny, for a second, how would we feel if Russia was to have a military alliance with Mexico and Russian military equipment would be positioned in Mexico? You know what would happen? We would have a complete meltdown in Washington. It wouldn't matter what party it was involved. So I think sometimes what happens to us, Danny, is because we have these two big, beautiful oceans, we have Canada and Mexico as neighbors, we have very lazy geostrategic thinking. We're very bad at having any sort of empathy or thinking about what our opponents, where they are geographically, geostrategically, and where their place in the world is. I think if we were able to do that sometimes, I think solutions to a lot of our foreign policy problems would come a lot easier.
Yeah, well, certainly couldn't argue with any of that. But let's stick for just a second on this ceasefire issue. I mentioned Lavrov. I want to show you exactly how he put it so you can see that body language as well. And then I want to get your thoughts on something on the backside.
We cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere.
So if that is true, and I can just tell you, just taking myself out of any kind of national head, mentality for the moment, and just saying, just militarily speaking, I mean, the last thing that Russia would want to do is to take the pressure off of Ukraine and just say, we're going to stop on the current line of contact, because now then that takes away the advantage that Russia has, which is to continue methodically pushing to the West. And they've even taken 2 more cities over the weekend, completed taking code. Then that's going to move them to the forward. If they take that all, if they're willing to have a ceasefire, now all of a sudden they lose their leverage because they can't continue to force Ukraine into a better position. So I don't see any, maybe you do, where we could offer anything that would make Putin say, yeah, that's a benefit to me, rather than continue forward.
I think you have to start talking about putting NATO on the table. I really do. I mean, I think for the Russians, Danny, I think for the short to medium term, I do agree. They do have the advantage. But if I'm Putin sitting in Moscow, thinking about the long term, they're not going to be able to, for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, continue to fund this war at the rate that they have. I mean, I don't think Putin wants to be, China's junior partner forever. I don't think they want to keep having to pay money to North Korea for arms and for more soldiers. I don't think they want to have to send Iran, Su-35 fighters, some of their best equipment, as payment for more drones and other pieces of military kit. So I think for Putin, I think if he takes the long view, I think if he can get NATO taken off the table, I think it could create the auspices of some sort of ceasefire, and then maybe we get to an armistice, something similar to like we've had in the Korean War, we've talked about before. I think that has advantages for all sides. I think Putin is a smart geopolitical player. I think that's really the only way out of this. I don't see there being a peace treaty where sides, agree to that Crimea is, I know we're going a little further, deeper into history, but, that Crimea is an inviolable part of Russia, or that Ukraine can agree to give the Donbass to Russia. I mean, these are things that both sides don't want to agree to. I think what we're looking at long term, and it might take us 6 months to get there, is sort of like a Korean War ending. Both sides agree to disagree, but they agree to stop fighting. And that's as good as you're going to get. I mean, that's horrible. It's a sad reality when probably around 1.5 million people are going to end up being injured and wounded when this war is over. But history tells us sometimes that is the best you're going to get.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate for a minute, and then, in fact, we'll just say, if what I'm about to propose happens, then what will that do to the Western / Trump side? So that was Lavrov. Here is Putin being putting a little bit firmer of a point on it.
What we need is not just a ceasefire. We need peace, a long-lasting peace.
We don't have any preconditions for talks. We are ready to engage in a conversation without preconditions. But there has to be a basis of something that we've agreed upon during the talks in Istanbul in late 2022. And based, of course, on the realities on the ground at this moment.
Now, what he has subsequently defined as realities on the ground is all four of the provinces that they annexed in 2022, plus Crimea, absolutely the administrative borders, which are still a good portion of them are still on the Russian-Ukraine side of the line of contact. So Russia, Putin has said those are Russians, and that there's in this telling, there is no way that he would ever agree to a ceasefire that's going to leave Russians on the Ukraine side of that line. So he's going to have it either administratively in negotiations or by force. So if Putin goes on that second path and says, no, that's not even negotiable, we won't even start talking anything less than that. If they do that, meaning they keep fighting until they either win it or they have it given to them, then what does that leave for the Trump side?
It's not going to be easy. I mean, I'm hoping that Putin has some ability to give a little bit here, and I think Trump would as well, and he would push Zelensky and the EU to go along with them. But I think for those of us who want some sort of grand bargain, right now, Danny, I just don't see it happening. I think what Putin is sort of hinting at maybe in those comments is a ceasefire plus maybe some sort of framework that everybody can get around. And I'll be honest with you, I do not have the wisdom to understand what that would look like, because looking at it from my vantage point, it doesn't seem like either side wants to recognize the other side's territorial claims. So how do you get to a place where both sides will start to cede territory? I'm going to be frank with you. I don't see it right now, to be honest with you. But as you said, the Russians are on the ascendancy. The Ukrainians are on the back foot. The Ukrainians are hoping for more military hardware. I don't even know if we have any more to send them at this point, to be honest with you. So it feels to me like the only way to stop the fighting is a ceasefire, and then maybe some sort of longer negotiations that go on, for a long period of time, months, maybe years. I don't even know if that's possible politically for all sides, but I think
militarily,
or militarily. So I think that the thing that Trump is going to push for, listening to my friends that are in the White House right now, is that it seems like ceasefire for Trump is what he's hoping for, and then to try and have a longer negotiation that I think, and again, this is putting my own personal spin on it, that could take a couple months to get to some sort of armistice, maybe. I mean, that I just don't see Putin wants peace. I think Trump wants peace, but nobody wants to give up anything to get to peace.
Yeah. And in fact, let's get back. I just showed you a minute ago what Zelensky said earlier today, but last week he seemed to be hedging a little bit at Davos, and he was talking primarily to a European audience. And during that speech, he kind of implied that, hey, maybe Trump isn't going to be looking out for either one of us. We might neither one of us be at the table, so we got to stick together. Watch this.
Right now, it's not clear whether Europe will even have a seat at the table when the war against our country ends. And we see how much influence China has on Russia. And we are deeply grateful to Europe for all the support it's given our country during this war. But will President Trump listen to Europe? Or will he negotiate with Russia and China without Europe?
Now, he went on to say in that speech that, listen, I need some guarantees, and I need Europeans to stand up and give it to us. We've had people like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron seem to imply maybe we could give some peacekeepers to go into Ukraine, which, of course, the Russians have said absolutely is a non-starter, even less possible than, a ceasefire on the current line of contact from what they're saying so far. But what are Zelensky's options here? Because it doesn't look to me like, and by the way, there's also, at least according to reports, Zelensky 3 times tried to get permission to come to the inauguration. That was said no. There was one of his guys came up, I think it was Andrei Yermak, came into Washington to talk with some of the Trump people, and that doesn't seem to have borne much fruit. So really, what kind of leverage does Zelensky have, even with Trump?
First of all, Danny, I just would want to say that I think it's really sad that Volodymyr Zelensky is trying to do this divide and conquer between the United States and Europe. I just don't think that's the right approach. I try to take the long view of these things. I mean, look at the amount of money and military hardware that we've taken from our own military stockpiles, endangering our country if we ever had a contingency with, over Taiwan.
Yeah, roger that.
I mean, that's a huge. I would if I had been president. I mean, I never would have done anything like that.
Yeah.
But we did it anyway. And Danny, think about it from the long perspective. The United States is $36 trillion in debt. This year alone, we are $1.9 trillion in debt in our deficit, and we are still giving money to Ukraine to this point. So how dare Volodymyr Zelensky actually try to lecture the United States and say, "Oh, Europe it might not have a seat at the table." You know, how do you feel about that? Look, the reason that Donald Trump was elected was because Americans feel that we have given and given and given, not to just Ukraine, but to lots of countries around the world, whether it comes to military hardware, opening our economies to so-called free trade, where Americans have lost their jobs. Well, America has done a lot for the world. But I think what Volodymyr Zelensky is going to find in the next couple of months is that Donald Trump is going to place some real limits on what we're able to do. And I think what he's going to say to Zelensky is, look, we've given you something close to $200 billion in aid, military hardware. We haven't held much back except aircraft carriers or F-35s or something like that.
Right.
I mean, to be honest. So what do you want from the United States? I mean, we cannot, Danny, send peacekeepers. I think that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. Because think about it, you don't need to be a military genius to figure this out. And if an American gets killed by a Russian sentry or soldier, whether it's accidental or not, you know what's going to happen? The neoconservatives are going to be like, "Oh my God, that's an Article 5,
straight up, yeah,
and
of
we're
course.
going to World War III." We're not. Donald Trump's not stupid. He's not going to do that. So I think Zelensky has to understand there's real limits now on what the West is going to do for him, and I think he needs to start figuring out what his negotiation strategy is going to be, and to be quite frankly, what he's willing to give up and what he wants. Realistically. And I think Putin seems to be maybe hedging in that direction. I think Trump, with comments, Danny, saying that, he's trying to understand the Russian position, which is the right thing to do if you're going to be a smart negotiator, is to understand the other side's viewpoint. There could be a way to get to something where all sides can end the fighting. Again, I don't know what we get beyond that, but at least we can do that.
See, and then this headline that Gary's showing right there, that Zelensky believes Trump can end the war, but must include Kiev. Yeah, really? Must he? Because I don't think that Zelensky is in a position to tell Trump anything that he must or must not do. The question is going to be what he is. And I think one of the reasons why Zelensky is saying this, Gary, if we can slightly change it from what we were talking about, if you can show these next two back-to-back, Trump talking about how he can work with Putin and Putin talking about how he can work with Trump.
Zelensky wants to make a deal. I don't know if Putin does. He might not. I don't know. He should make a deal. I think he's destroying Russia by not making a deal. I think Russia's going to be in big trouble. You take a look at their economy. You take a look at the inflation in Russia. So I would hope. I got along with him great, and I would hope he wants to make a deal.
I'd like to say that Russia never refused to come into contact with the United States administration. And it is through no fault of ours that the previous administration refused to communicate. I always had business-like relations with the previous US president that were very business-like and pragmatic. But there was trust as well.
So you just said that if you want to make a negotiated deal, you have to understand what your opponent is thinking, what they want, and what's important to them. And so it seems that both Trump and Putin are considering each other's positions.
I do. And I think, Danny, even you could even go so far to Trump to even throw out a tweet or a Truth Social post to say, look, just like he did with Kim Jong-un, you remember those days back in 2019, where, look, I'll meet you. Yeah, right. I'll meet you next Thursday in Zurich. Meet me here, and let's talk, and let's start the ball rolling. And yeah, the Ukrainians and the EU will get very upset. But look, at the end of the day, we know the two parties that are going to have the biggest seats at the table, and of course, Ukraine is going to have a big seat as well. But it's going to be Russia and the United States that will be, in many respects, supervising the peace, if you will. And, you know, I don't think there's anything wrong in making such a statement. So I think there is an understanding that the war needs to come to an end. I think there's an understanding of what the big things that both sides want, but the road path to get there is going to be the tricky part, taking the emotions out of it. Obviously all the Ukraine has lost so many hundreds of thousands of people, which is heartbreaking. I mean, I feel for them. But at the same time, nobody wants to see this thing end up in some sort of accidental escalation where, you know, people start throwing around words like nuclear weapons again. I mean, we've had that happen too many times already. And I just don't see that there's no need for that. There is a way to get this done. It's just going to take both sides to really put some political capital behind it. And
Harry, there's an additional challenge we haven't talked about yet, but it is definitely talking about seeing how things look from the other side, the Russian side, so you understand what your environment is going into negotiations. Russians are saying, yeah, about that seat for Zelensky, there's some problems there. You may recall, and not many people in the West do anymore, but in October of 2022, Zelensky passed a deal that said, you know what, we're not going to negotiate with anything. This, just for context, this came shortly after Russia annexed the 4 oblasts. I mean, like a matter of days later. And so according to the media at the time, said Kiev's decision represents a quick and unbending rejection of Putin's September 30th call for bilateral negotiations. Just for the conference, what happened after he annexed it, Putin said, hey, how's about we get together and we talk about a negotiated settlement to this? And in his speech at the Kremlin, Putin declared, we call on the Kiev regime to cease fire. Interesting, he was calling for one there, in all combat actions immediately. Stop this war that they claimed Kiev unleashed in 2014 and return to the negotiating table. We have said more than once that we are ready for negotiations. However, the People's Republic of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia have made their choice. So he was laying out this hard position even back then that says we're not going to give up anything short of that now. And this, of course, was just after they had just announced a mobilization of 300,000. Ukraine had just made significant gains in Kherson and in Kharkiv Oblast. That was when they were flush with victory, because it was, as it's going to turn out, their only 2 major battles during this war. And Putin said, hey, let's have negotiations. In response, Zelensky said, yeah, we ain't even going to talk. He actually wrote a law that says nobody's going to talk to Russia as long as Putin is in office. He literally made it illegal to do so. So I believe it was earlier today, a reporter, when Zelensky made that previous comment there that we showed at the top about, you know, wanting to have a seat at the table, one of the reporters, at least in the West, actually asked a hard question. Yeah, but what about that October 5th law that you signed? Here's what he said.
What was interesting in those remarks that he gave alongside Maya Sandu, though, was that when he was asked about the official ban that is in place in Ukraine on talking with Vladimir Putin, it was signed into law in October 2022 that Ukraine would not negotiate with Vladimir Putin, perhaps with Russia, but not with that president. And when he was asked about it, though, Volodymyr Zelensky appeared to say that that ban doesn't apply to him. He said, essentially, I banned it for everyone else, and then gave rather a rambling answer about how at the time Vladimir Putin was trying to reach out to potentially pro-Russian or, compromised actors.
Okay, so there's, you got Zelensky going, yeah, well, that doesn't apply to me. I mean, I'm above the law. I mean, I don't have to worry about that kind of thing. It was for other people. Here's the problem. Zelensky can say that. It's his country. He can just say, yeah, that doesn't apply and go on. Problem is, there's the other half of that equation. Now, here's what Putin has to say.
We can sign an agreement only with a legitimate person. And Rada and the chairman of Rada are legitimate, are the only legitimate people. We need to sign this document only with a legitimate representative of a legitimate authority in the Ukraine.
So the Russians say he's not legitimate because in 2024, when they were supposed to have a presidential election, when his term of office came to an end, they just said, yeah, we don't want to do that. Oh, it's in war. We can't do it. Even though Russia did have an election, even during that year, even though the U.S. did have an election during its civil war, we just said, okay, you can't. Well, now here's the consequences, because Russia's saying, we're not even going to talk to you until you have an election. So with Zelensky's law and with Putin saying, we're not going to talk to you, how does he get a seat at this table, Harry?
It's you know what, this is one of those things where the knot just keeps getting tighter and tighter, and to undo it just keeps getting harder and harder. You know, I keep getting brought back, Danny, to this idea. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, but I've had a lot of different discussions over the years with different Ukrainian officials, and the one thing I always press them a little bit on, in the nicest way possible, is how are you going to negotiate with the Russians if your concept of victory is warped from reality? And what I mean by that is, if you think that you have to get the Crimea back, if you think you have to get Donbass back, if you think you have to get paid, hundreds of billions of dollars in reparations, that you should join NATO, how do you think that negotiation is going to go when you have no way to achieve these things? And it's a huge problem, because the Ukrainians don't ever seem to move off that official position of absurdness. And this is something I think Donald Trump is going to have to deal with, because the Ukrainians seem to put themselves in these sort of geopolitical boxes that they're not going to be able to get out of, whether it's this weirdo concept of victory that is complete. Even if the United States sent all of its military forces to Ukraine, would be kind of hard to do. Or these straitjackets of diplomacy where they say, well, we're not going to negotiate with Putin, and only Zelensky can do that. And you know what I think, Dan, the reason why they keep saying, oh, we don't want to negotiate with Putin, because I think that the real ultimate strategy, at least initially when it came to the war in Ukraine and Russia, was that they hoped that Putin would collapse, that he'd fall out of power, that there'd be some sort of Russian revolution or something that would throw him out. And Joe Biden said that. Remember when he went to Poland a couple of years ago, what was his remark? This guy's got to go. Something like that.
Yeah, that man cannot remain in power.
That's it. Yes, yeah. Yes. So, I think that's always been sort of the secret hope. And when that didn't happen, the West was sort of like, what do we do now?
And by the way, it's not lost on Russians that it's Biden who's out of power and Putin who's still in. That's kind of a sore spot for his boisterous comment there. But you mentioned a warped view of reality on the Ukraine side. This is, I think, of many problems, this may be one of the central problems to there being a negotiated settlement that has any possibility of being a not bad outcome. There is no good outcome for Ukraine at this point, by the way, I'll point out. But I want to show you something. So this is a headline from yesterday in the Kiev press. And they said there was some reports that Velika Novoselka had been surrounded. And the Ukraine side is saying, no, there is no threat of Ukrainian forces encirclement in Velika Novoselka. That was yesterday. Also yesterday, here is this report for what actually was going on the battlefield in Velika Novoselka.
The most important updates for the previous 24 hours is coming from the South Donetsk direction. According to information we have, according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, on January 26 of 2025, as a result of active offensive actions by units of the 5th Guards Separate Tank Brigade of the 36th Army and the 40th Guards Marine Brigade of the Vostok Group of Forces, the settlement of Velika Novoselka of the Donetsk People's Republic was taken by the Russians.
So the city was taken. It wasn't even just surrounded. About 36 hours prior to that headline there, the city had been cut in half, and all of the guys in the south, there was several hundred Ukrainian soldiers, had been in fact surrounded. And when they're making the claim that there is no risk of that, the city was already fallen. So if you can't even acknowledge what's actually going on the ground, how are you going to get into a negotiation where you want to try to get anything from the Russian side?
Danny, the only thing I could say is, and this is horrible, and it pains me to say it, but in order to have a negotiated settlement, you have to have a reality of where you are on the battlefield, what you can get from a settlement, and what your future looks like. And if I was President Zelensky, maybe I wouldn't be able to do this, but if I was able to take the much longer view, what I would do is I would look at these battlefield losses. I'd say to myself, well, the West doesn't really have any more military equipment to send me. Even if they did, even if they sent me the very best military hardware they have, it's going to take years to actually make it do something on the battlefield.
Because it'll take years to have troops that can use it.
Right. Even worse than that. I mean, that's exactly. So Zelensky is forced into a very short, bad term position where, yeah, he's eventually going to have to make a deal that he probably doesn't like, and the Ukrainian people aren't going to like. But imagine this. Imagine if you took the long view and you said, okay, I'm going to take a deal where I'm going to probably lose some territory. It's going to hurt me politically. But in the long view, I think if Zelensky understood that, he probably would be able to get himself into the European Union. He's not going to be able to join NATO, but I think it seems pretty clear that he's going to be able to get hundreds of billions of dollars of brand new military hardware to restock his military. We'll put the actual training and manpower part of that aside. He's going to at least get on paper the hardware he needs to deter the Russians. He's going to get more than likely trillions of dollars in economic aid and grants and lots of Western and European and Asian companies who want to come in and rebuild Ukraine. If you take the very long view, Danny, on Ukraine, they could rebuild themselves and become a very powerful, rich country. I mean, they have the agricultural resources, they have the mineral resources. They will need to have a lot of, the millions that have left Ukraine to come back and create a position where people feel comfortable that they're not going to get invaded again by the Russians. But if you took the long-term view, Ukraine could have a bright future. But it's going to take some guts to get there. It's going to take that hard look at things to understand of what Ukraine could be.
There's a couple of big problems with that, but I'll mention two here. If you don't take, and it's not even long term, I would say generational view, because for what you described there, it would take a generation to get there, but it's possible. If you fail to take that view, though, and are unwilling to pay the political hit that you correctly identified in the near term, you're not going to have that future, because then you're going to basically leave the Russians with the position, we'll either get what we want at the negotiating table or we'll take it, i.e. a lot of that farmland you're talking about, a lot of those rare earth minerals, et cetera, will be under Russian control, and they'll be going to Moscow, not to anywhere in the West. That's one of the big problems.
And it could be worse, Danny. This way. No, it's okay. It could get even worse, because the longer this war goes on, the fear I have that one side or the other is going to make some sort of accidental mistake where you put us on a path to NATO-Russian confrontation. I mean, we've already had incidents where Russian missiles went into Poland. Everybody thought, oh my God, maybe the Russians did it on purpose. I mean, the Ukrainian side could have the same problems, where they have an errant Patriot battery go wild, or, who knows? I mean, there's lots of different paths to escalation. I mean, the Ukrainians keep flying drones towards Moscow. What if them accidentally hit the Kremlin? I mean, I'm just speculating here. There's so many paths to escalation that all sides need to understand that it's time to wind this war down. There's not going to be any grand winner in this thing, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and there could be a grand loser, though. And one last thing I want to look at, because it gets very little attention in the West. Everybody's right now just almost myopically focused just on whether Zelensky is going to be at the table or what Putin and Trump are going to discuss. But what comes after, however this is going to be wound down, and it will wound down at some point, whether for military conquest or through negotiated settlement, it'll come to an end. What comes next, though, hasn't gotten enough attention, and I think it needs to, because who is going to pay to rebuild Ukraine? You mentioned something about a lot of money. Who's going to pay that money?
That's a very good question. So I've been working my sources in Ukraine over the last couple of weeks to put together a new story for 1945, and I'm going to break a little bit with you here on Deep Dive. So I spoke to a very senior Ukrainian financial, trying to give I don't want to, he spoke to me on background, so I don't want to betray him, but we'll say a very close economic advisor to that speaks directly to President Zelensky. He's part of the Ukrainian government. And what he said was striking. I asked him, I said, what do you think it would cost to rebuild Ukraine today in $20-25? He was very quick to give an answer. He said at least $2 trillion. And before I could say any more, Danny, he said this, and the United States needs to pay for it. I was taken aback. I said, well, why do you think that? He said, it's the United States' fault that the war between Russia and Ukraine broke out in the first place.
Oh, wait. He said, whose fault was it?
Yeah. And I said to him, well, why do you think that? Tell me. I'm very interested. I want to understand your perspective. And he said, because the United States did not push to get Ukraine into NATO, it gave Russia a window of an opportunity to invade and basically destroy Ukraine. So there's no viable chance that would be able to join NATO anytime soon. So when I heard this, I said, okay, I appreciate your perspective. I mean, I put my editor cap on. I, neither disagree or agree. I said, okay. So I reached out to other contacts in the Ukrainian government to kind of get a pulse check of this, to see where they are when it comes to reconstruction, what it would cost, who's to blame, those same questions. And there was a pretty wide perspective that I wouldn't say they used the same exact wording and phraseology, but they all agreed the cost to rebuild Ukraine would be about 1.5. I got 1.75 trillion to about $2 trillion for full rebuilding. And when it came to the costs, everybody I spoke to in the Ukrainian government, including another official who's pretty close to Zelensky, said that they didn't feel Ukraine should pay for it, that the West was rich enough, powerful enough, that if they wanted a Ukraine that was a full partner with the West, that it should be the West. And I some responses too were, Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, one offered Australia as a possible funding source, that it should be the collective democracies, if you will, that should pay to rebuild Ukraine. And this is my opinion. I leave those opinions where they are. But from my perspective, I don't think that's going to work out very well for Ukraine if that's what they're expecting. Because first of all, again, like we just talked about, Danny, the United States is $36 trillion in debt, $1.9 trillion deficit this year alone. We cannot afford to rebuild Ukraine. I would assume we will give some money and aid to help rebuild, but we do not have the ability to bear the lion's share, especially when we just spent $6 trillion trying to get out of the COVID-19 pandemic. That was basically our World War III slush fund if we were ever going to need one. The financial markets are against us, Danny. The bond markets, they look at Donald Trump and they're afraid that he's going to spend a lot more money, raise that deficit more. They're warning him, don't you dare do it. It's going to end up very badly for you. Now, maybe the Europeans will put some money into it. That's possible. But as we get to where this war starts to end, I think there needs to be conversations with the Ukrainians on what those expectations look like. Because I think,
well, yeah, I mean, just look. I mean, here's just a couple things that just jump right out of me. Number one, Donald Trump, who has all been saying that we are already spending too much money in Europe, and we're going to maybe start cutting things back on our existing requirements or obligations. The last thing he would want to do is to say, but you know what? We'll take a lion's share of giving cash to Ukraine. I just don't see that happening. But then the second thing, you look at the European half of that equation. I mean, look at how much money has been totally from the West given, and how much of that has been the U.S. and how much of that has been Europe. And it ain't that big in Europe. Not quite $2 trillion, if my math serves me correctly. I mean, they may be lucky if they get $100 billion. I mean, honestly, in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the Ukrainians, I mean, again, taking the long view, their path to reconstruction is to go to the private equity markets, to go to private industry. And once there is some sort of ceasefire, peace negotiation, armistice, whatever, they need to look at how other countries have rebuilt from war. And it isn't always from, the generosity of the United States or the West. I mean, there's trillions of dollars in private equity and private money out there that would love to move into Ukraine, that would love to modernize their country. I mean, if you think about, Danny, the needs that Ukraine has, they need an internet infrastructure. They need clean water. They need clean air. They need to completely rebuild their economy from the ground up.
Their energy grid, their electricity, their heating system have all but been destroyed. So that's got to be almost from scratch. Yeah.
Their nuclear energy needs to be safe and secure. I mean, there's the needs go on and on. So there's opportunities for Zelensky to partner with private companies around the world who would love to get in on rebuilding that country. And I think it would be wrong in the wrong strategy for the Ukrainians to say, well, just to stick your hand out and say, give me money. They're not going to have a very good response from the American people, because that's one of the reasons that Donald Trump was elected in the first place. And again, the long-term view, Danny, is that the United States, when we think about its relationship with Europe, I think one of the things Trump is starting to think about, maybe when the Ukraine war is over, is, do we need 100,000 troops in Europe when Europe's GDP is almost the equal of the United States? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all to me. I mean, just from a very practical perspective. So I think these are the things that are going to come out as we start getting closer to peace negotiations.
And one of the things, Harry, that just anguishes me, because it just almost inevitably will come to certain this one degree or another, and that is, and we've shown many times on our channel this famous clip from, I think, November of Lindsey Graham talking with glee about basically we'll just rape Ukraine, whatever's left of all of their rare earths and everything is to get us money, whatever. And I mean, he's saying it out loud. And I assure you, there's other people that are not saying it out loud, but behind the scenes, they want to take control of all this stuff. And whatever's left of Ukraine will not really be in a position to demand good terms. And I fear that you're going to end up seeing a lot of this just carcass to be picked over by others for generations. That's the truth.
And that would be horrible. That would take the tragedy of this war and make it even worse. That what is left for Ukraine needs to be rebuilt for Ukrainians, so they can have some sort of future ahead for them. And I think that can happen. I really do. I mean, look what happened to South Korea at the end of the Korean War. There wasn't anything left.
They were wiped out. Yeah,
96% of the buildings in South Korea were wiped out. They had to completely start from scratch. Look where they are today. Present political situation excluded, but look where they are today. They have one of the most powerful economies on earth. They have brands that are the envy of the world. You know, if you take that long view, 40, 50 years out, that could be something Ukraine could aspire for. But again, you have to take that long-term political view where in the short term you're going to take a ding, but in the long term there's going to be benefit. And again, we can't listen to the Lindsey Grahams of the world, because I think history shows they've been wrong time and time again.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good just rule of thumb. Just ignore whatever Lindsey Graham says.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, we really appreciate you talking about this stuff, and especially just basically breaking news, which I guess is going to come out in 1945 soon.
A couple days, absolutely.
A couple of days. We'll just direct everybody. Y'all just keep looking at that. Whenever that does come out, we'll let people know so they can follow the link to that story. I'm looking eager to read that myself. But in the meantime, we appreciate you coming on today a whole lot and give us some clarity on what is to come.
Thanks, Danny.
And also, just to let you know, we've got another show coming up later this afternoon where we're going to get into some of the other issues related to this whole Russia-Ukraine war that you probably have not seen yet. Also, though, to give you kind of a preview, what could really upend a lot of these talks is the status quo that people think they understand about where this war is. We're going to have Colonel Jacques Beau back on tomorrow at noon Eastern time. That's going to have some additional breaking news, something that you haven't heard anywhere else, about a possibility for basically an uprising on the Ukraine side of the line of contact in the rear of the Ukraine army, which could completely change the tactical dynamics of this war and will have a direct impact on any kind of negotiations that may come. Something you haven't heard anywhere else. Be sure to turn in noon tomorrow. In the meantime, be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that on your way out today. We always really appreciate that. And we will see you tomorrow on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.